Welcome, everyone, to the second episode of the Distil-Nation podcast. Yes, I'm excited to come in and talk about what's a bit of an odd topic for us, because we've only done one episode.
We've done one episode about New Zealand, and already we're leaving the country.
Yeah, see you, New Zealand. We're going to hop the ditch and talk a bit about Tasmania.
Well, I mean, it makes sense in the context of you were just there.
Yep.
So great that you got to meet with some distillers, visit some distilleries. But it's a really, even in the context of Australian whiskey, Tasmania is its own really interesting kind of ecosystem there.
It really is. I mean, looking from the outside in, you sort of think like, oh, Tasmania is maybe more like Scotland, or something like that. It's just its own little micro region, right? But when you go there, it's really just its own country, really. It's totally different. Like, it's New Zealand 2.0 almost, because like when you go there, it just feels like Central Otago. I don't know, have you been? Have you ever been?
Not to Tasmania, no.
You haven't been. Yeah, Central Otago, basically, everywhere. Okay. And mixed in with a bit of like Yosemite National Park and places and stuff like that. Like Mount Wellington in Hobart, and it looks over Hobart. It looks like the dome at Yosemite. Like it really does have that cliff face with the half dome sort of thing. It's a beautiful town. I highly recommend it. Everybody listening, watching, go to Hobart. It's really cool. Now, before we get into it, I guess the first things we'll say is if you're new here, welcome to everybody. It's great to see so many people really interested in the podcast and interested about New Zealand spirits. If the best thing you can do to sort of help us would be just to leave a review. No matter where you're listening to, Apple or Spotify or Google or YouTube, whatever it is.
Wherever. Yeah,
leave a review. That just sort of helps the algorithms push it to more people when they're searching for podcasts and such.
Absolutely. And we don't know what you don't know, and so the best way to answer your questions is to actually ask them.
Yep.
And you can jump into the DMs on any of our socials or distil-nation@gmail.com. We'll answer your questions.
Distil-NationNZ@gmail.com. Yes.
Distil-NationNZ@gmail.com.
We had one comment from a user from our first episode in China, of all places, and they said basically they were looking for Pocono because we did say it was available there. It is available in China. We're just not sure exactly where, but they said they couldn't find it on Taobao, which is sort of their main where they buy everything from. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, that was a good comment.
The team were only just there. Give it time.
Yeah, exactly. It'll spread, right? Yeah. And just we've had quite a few comments from people just saying they're excited about the podcast. I think. Hey.
Cool.
Yeah, and but that's it. That's where we're at, and I think the topic today is just sort of how do we kind of relate, all this to New Zealand, really.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's always a case of how do we grow, how do we improve when we're looking to see what others are doing. And I think what is interesting about looking to Tasmania, they're in the South Pacific, like us. They've got geographic and kind of climatic conditions that are more similar to what New Zealand might face.
Yep.
So I think from that kind of perspective, it's interesting. But what were your initial kind of reactions? How many distilleries did you get to? How many did you get to?
So I got the three distilleries. I got to go see the Lark sort of center in town, as well as Belgrove distillery and a Nonesuch distillery. So two actually of the three of them are actually kind of out there on the Tasmania side of things. But luckily I was able to spend some time with that Lark center and they have a huge library of Tasmanian whiskies, and I got to try a lot of them over a couple of days, mind you, half pours, but yeah. The library is huge in Tasmania, and I mean, there's not just whiskey there; they're doing gin as well. But gin didn't give me the impression that like Tasmanian gin was like a huge thing, Mm-hmm. It's more of a it's there for sure, but it certainly seemed like whiskey is the push.
Okay.
And I don't know if you know the history of Tasmanian whiskey a bit, but
before we jump into the history of Tasmanian whiskey, let's. So Lark, tell me what I'm looking at here.
So Lark is sort of the original Tasmanian distillery. Bill Lark, who it's named after, he's the one who sort of pushed the laws in the 1990s, because it was actually illegal from the 1800s onwards to open a distillery in Tasmania. And Bill Lark sort of discovered that and thought that's a bit odd. And he pushed the laws through to get Tasmania to be able to open distilleries again. So if you're looking at Tasmanian whiskey and somewhere to start, most people will start with Lark. And that is their classic offering right there.
What's the barrel? Does it say?
Does it say?
Classic cask, 43%, Lark House style, hint of Tasmanian peat. It's not telling me the barrel on there, but non-chill filtered, no colour. That's a beautiful wee sample bottle.
Yeah, their bottling over there is really high quality. And one thing I did notice sort of about Tasmanian spirits in general is the cask releases. The difference is that there's a ton of them, basically. So, like, you can go to Lark and you could look at a lot of different releases, and much of them are available all at once. They're just sort of there, but there might be one cask, but they also might be a bunch of casks, and they really like to tell you all the different casks they've been in, and it's quite interesting for that. So, yeah.
Can we also just appreciate between the first episode and the second that you've now got engraved Glencairns? They are beautiful.
Yeah, Herrick Creek Glencairn glasses are now available on the website. We've got them in single or double packs. And I'm excited to have them. Quite cool. Something you sort of dream of when you start a distillery is have your own branded whiskey glass.
It's not the first step, though.
No, it's definitely not.
Cheers.
Yeah. And I'm just actually looking at the legs on this. They're actually kind of funky legs. They are more escapey legs than they are.
Rather than individual
residual
strands coming down, it's almost like a wave that's retreating all at once. It's
quite interesting, eh?
Yes.
Yeah. One thing that sort of drew me there in the first place was that I do know there's a couple New Zealand distilleries that do rely on Bill Lark for their tasting notes and such. Bill Lark he's really a giant over there. And if anybody doesn't know about him, just like go do a Google for Bill Lark. You'll find out a ton of information. But I know Lammermoor Distillery. They send all their bottlings over to Bill to do some tasting notes, and I do also believe that the New Zealand Whisky Collection has a really big tie with Bill Lark, among others, I'm sure. But those are the two that sort of stuck with me.
Well, it's always good to see that the trans-Tasman relationship is strong.
Yeah.
It's nice to see.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, what more? Tell me about that history in the first place. Jumping back to where we were before we dived into this.
Yeah.
History of Tasmanian distilling.
Well, that was kind of it, really. It was just that they couldn't open a distillery in Tasmania for so long, which is quite unique, really. I mean, most people had prohibition in the early 1900s, but Tasmania had just been dry since like the 1880s, I think, something like that, 1880s, and there was a law, and there was a big movement there to just get rid of all of it. So they did, and at that time, I believe that there was sort of a lot of, the bathtub gin sort of stuff going on. There's a lot of dangerous stuff being made, but so it was illegal for over 100 years, and Bill Lark is the one that sort of pushed this forward. And starting up in the early days, I talked to Rex over at Nonsuch Distillery. He was one of the earlier distilleries, and he was making gin at the time. He wasn't doing any whiskey. But he said basically everyone would go to Bill and copy Bill's setup. That was kind of the thing, and Bill was happy to do that. They just bring him in, and here's the stills we get. Here's the setup you're using. Here's the barley. Here's the water filtration. Here's everything we're doing, and everyone would basically just copy him. And today that's sort of changing a little bit, but basically any big distillery you're going to find on Tasmania probably started with Bill Lark. So if you're diving into Tasmanian whiskey, Lark is probably the place to start. And they are really only doing single malt, my understanding as well. So, yeah. But it's quite an interesting nose, isn't it?
It is. It's that vanilla, some butterscotch.
Yeah, and I did find, tasting a lot of the Tasmanian whiskies, that there's actually a unifying note. There's a note that sort of ties all these whiskies together. and I couldn't really describe it to you, unfortunately. I tried so hard. I sat there with so many glasses, and I'm thinking, like, what is this note that I'm smelling in this distillery's and this distillery's whiskey? When I really shouldn't. Like, they're two different distilleries from different parts of the island, and why would it be the same? And I'm not exactly sure. I couldn't tell you, but it's neat to know that they do have a distinct profile. So
the name's just popped into my head, and that it seems like this Bill Lark is very much the Dr. Swan of the South Pacific, and that so many distilleries across Japan, Scotland, most of the Northern Hemisphere, they're getting started, and they will bring in Jim Swan, and he would help them. All right, this is what you need to do, and here's your still, all this kind of...
Yeah.
So it's that practice of bringing in outside experts. And I think that is something that I love about the industry, is very much, okay, somebody's looking to get started. People are protective about the category as a whole, but they recognise, well, if you're making some good stuff, I'm going to learn from you. If somebody falls in love with your whiskey, there's a very good chance that will open them up to the category in general.
Yep.
And if we work together, a rising tide's going to lift all ships.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's great to see that is... I did not know the story about Tasmanian whiskey, so that's really awesome to hear.
And there are actually now 70 whiskey distilleries.
70?
70, yeah. And I think there's more than 70. 70 is the 70 plus, numbers.
Because Tasmania... So for context, you've got the big continent of Australia, and then the tiny kind of triangle-shaped island down the bottom there. That's Tasmania. Yeah. And it's not a big island.
It's not. No, it's really not. And most of these distilleries, though, they are operating on a small scale, I found. Sure. So, I mean, while there are some now that are pushing up the still sizes and adding more and more stills, most of these distilleries are very small on scale. So they're doing, very small scale production, and they're really just pushing out, sort of their local, if you will, style of their single malt. It's usually single malt, I would say. Yeah. The other cool thing that I found really interesting is there's a lot of independent bottlers as well. There's about, a lot. There's about half a dozen, I'd say, somewhere in there that I know about. So they're actually going to these different distilleries and pulling barrels and releasing them under their own brand, as you'd see in Scotland, which is really cool, actually.
Well, the market has got to be mainland Australia.
I mean, it's got to be, right? Like, how many people are there in Tasmania? And not only that, not only are there independent bottlers, but there's also a lot of intermingling between the distilleries. Like, people are going to different distilleries for their mashes or for getting the first wash run done, the stripping run, and then sending you take that strip to your smaller distillery, and now you can just do the final spirit run. And that's allowed over there because they don't have a clear definition on what's a single malt, for example, right?
Which is something that we talked about in our Whisky 101 episode, about how the DSA has that framework in place. Yep. What is a New Zealand single malt? What is a New Zealand whiskey?
Mm-hmm. And of course, they don't have that. No, they're still operating on those very loose sort of official laws that exist, just Australia-wide sort of thing. So, with single malt, we would say that it's made from a single distillery from malt. But of course, over there, you could probably get away with getting it fermented or, partially distilled somewhere else. And then you could do the last run at your distillery, and you might still call that a single malt. Not everyone's doing that, of course. I'm not saying that's being done by everyone or anything like that, but you could do it for sure. So quite interesting. I mean, just the scale of what's going on over there on that small island, compared to us. Quite interesting. Yeah.
So, I mean, it seems like far more distilleries, but of the sheer number, many are just of a much, much smaller scale than, even when you started and you're running in your garage, is that kind of the size of scale? Like, give us some context.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say it was garage scale, but certainly, within, you're running a still about this size, 250, 300 liters, somewhere in that range. That's a very common still size over there. basically under 1,000 liters stills is sort of what they're running, and most of them are locally made as well. There's 2 or 3 still makers in Tasmania.
Wow.
And they're making beautiful stills. And there's other people like Peter over at Belgrove Distillery, which we'll talk about for sure. He fashions all his own equipment. He's made his own stills and everything like that from scratch. So, there is a variety for sure, but they're not going to Scotland to buy the stills. They're really making them on the island.
It's quite a homegrown industry.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Very interesting, yeah. And it's good to see them sort of work that into it, eh? Like when Lark here says made of Tasmania, it's quite a good way of looking at it, isn't it?
Well, I've slowly been working my way through this, and at first I thought, oh yes, it's quite light and it's quite bright, but yeah, that peat is very deceptive, and it's an undercurrent. It's not in your face at all, and it's really just on that kind of finish that you go, oh no, there is a wee bit of smoke there. There is a wee bit, and it's just a hint.
It is gentle, eh? It's very. If you didn't tell me there was peat in it, I wouldn't really.
No, I don't think there would have been.
No.
Which, important question: what is their peat? What is it made up of?
Really interesting, actually, with the peat. They actually do have to get a license to dig up the peat. So there's only 3 distilleries in Tasmania that can dig peat. One of them is Belgrove. I can't remember the other 2, but I think Lark is one of them. The ground, I understand, what Peter at Belgrove was telling me is that his peat is tea tree. So it's basically Manuka peat. So it does depend where you get it from the island, of course, and it's definitely not a Scottish peat, and it's definitely not a New Zealand peat. It's its own peat.
Yeah.
It's unique, but it does seem to what I was kind of understanding is it's kind of that tea tree Manuka peat. So at old forests, that have been swamped and decayed and whatnot. But yeah, it's not a lot of it going on, and I do understand as well though that just because you're getting a peated New Tasmanian whiskey doesn't mean you're getting Tasmanian peat in your whiskey, because they are doing a lot of importing of barley and smoke grains from Scotland.
Right.
Yeah.
So, for context, in New Zealand, where a lot of our grains, a lot of our barley is grown here, much of it in the South Island.
Yeah.
Is Tasmania grain country? Because even Australia itself, which I have been to, it's not a place where I drove around thinking, oh boy, look at all of those barley fields. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it is a dry place, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. And Tasmania looks dry at this time of year, and it's spring. Like, it shouldn't look dry, So, it's not a huge amount, I don't think, of grain being grown. For example, Belgrove does grow all his own grain on site. But certainly, I don't think there's much of that going on. It's very mountainous, like it's hilly. It's very, very, like there's not a lot of plains. There's, a couple spots where there's some flattish land, but it's not really meant for it, eh? So, yeah, they've either got to bring it in really from Australia or from overseas still somewhere. And of course, if you want peated barley, if you're going to get it, I guess, from the source that most people would think of where it's from, so Scotland.
I mean, how many places have got their own malting floor where they can... Yeah, not many worldwide.
Yeah, exactly. Again, I'll talk about Peter again at Belgrove, because he's not, of course, what his whole philosophy was is he's sort of doing 1 kilometer whiskey. So he's growing the grains, he's smoking the grains, the peat is from, the property as well. It's all aged. Everything is done right there on site. The water's from the site and everything, right? So it's quite cool to see his smoking setup, because I don't know if you know, like, his smoking setup, but it's in an old industrial clothes dryer, right? And it looks very rusty, and like it's just out in the middle of the field. It looks totally out of place. It just looks like it's junk, right? But like, it's so cool. He's got 2 of them sitting right next to each other, and what he does is he sets a fire of whatever he's smoking it with, which could be peat or it could be sheep shit, which is what the holy shit is for. Okay. And he'll pump that smoke into the dryer as it tumbles the grain, which he says he malts as well in there. So he's doing all the malting, all the smoking, everything right there, and he even takes it out wet and he turns it into a porridge because it immediately goes into the mash. He doesn't have to store it, so he doesn't mind if it's wet. So quite a unique process. Of course, not everyone's doing that, but you know, that's why I had to go see them. I just thought it was so unique.
Okay, so let's just address it, seeing as you've brought it up.
Yep.
Rye malt smoked with Belgrove sheep dung. Holy shit.
Holy shit's what it's called. Yep.
Why? Why?
He told me he's not sure if he got the idea from the Icelandic guy who's doing it. I think it was Floki Whisky or something, or if he came up with it first. But he can't really remember. He told me, but he's not too sure. But he said he gave it a try one day, and it just came out with such a unique flavor. Then he went with it. And this isn't even like the smokiest version of it, because what else they've done is they've taken the smoked grain version, put it into the barrel, and then they've pumped smoke into the finished barrel as well. So like the finished whiskey is in the barrel, they put a pipe into the whiskey in the barrel, and they push more smoke into it, and it come out almost black. I tell you, it was very potent.
Strikes me. I'm sure you've seen the people making cocktails, and they get that smoker that sits over the top of your rocks glass.
Yeah.
So they're just doing that to the. Yeah, I don't know. Although it's coming in hot at 56.5% ABV.
He does not hold back on his ABVs. Yeah,
that is. So okay, talk to me about once it goes into the barrel. Seeing as we just. What's their angel's share like? Looking at, so how much is evaporating? Is it the water or is it the alcohol?
Yeah.
And overall, you know, okay, they don't have the set kind of rules, but are they leaving it for 2-3 years? I'm picking that you would be very hard pressed to come across anything even close to a 10-year-old Tasmanian or
You'd be surprised, actually.
Well,
you might be surprised.
Surprise me.
So the likes of like Sullivan's Cove was one that I looked at, and even maybe Lark. There's definitely 17-year-old, 21-year-old, and they're very rare and they're very expensive.
For
sure. But here, I'll pass that to you. They do exist, and it seems to have been sort of part of their plan from the get-go that this is something they were going to aim for. I don't know much about that, unfortunately. I don't know like what's left in the barrel. No, it's not certainly not what they're going for. Because most of the barrel's over there, and which is a whole nother topic. I just saw your face when you smelt that. Holy shit!
That is.
I low key love it. I love it.
I just wasn't prepared for
no.
that.
But it is sort of that smell when you walk onto a farm, isn't it?
Yeah, dried dung.
Yeah.
And I am very familiar walking around a sheep farm.
Yeah.
Growing up on the mighty Tyree Plains, I've walked across many a few, and yep, it's that dried, smoky,
grassy, and totally. Like it's got that. It is a sheep field on a hot day, like on a hot day when the sun is baking all the dung that's sitting on there.
And the grass is really dry, on the verge of smoky kind of.
Absolutely, like almost you could light a match and the whole field goes, that sort of thing. Yeah, it's captured in that whiskey. And it's one of those things where you smell at first, because this is sort of a sidebar, sorry, but when I first got my first bottle of Lefroy. Got it from Whiskey Galore here in Christchurch, because I was that old by the time I tried Lefroy for the first time. I brought it home, and I remember opening the bottle and thinking, what the hell have I done? This is disgusting. And I just spent how much on this bottle, And I remember pouring myself a glass, and I just sat there at night, one night, and just smelling it. I didn't even taste it, I just sat there, and I'd take a smell, and I'd put it down. I still don't like it, Mm-hmm. But then I kept finding myself just going for it. Oh, it's back at my nose again. How did that happen? Oh, that was a bigger sniff that time. Oh, wow. Maybe I am liking it, And suddenly I was really inhaling it, And I think this has the same thing for me. It's just one of those things that's so out there. It's not an unusual smell, but I can't pull myself away from smelling it,
Good friend of mine was given bottle of Lafroig as a gift. They were like, "Oh, you like whiskey," and just got him a bottle of your straight up Lafroig 10. And he then went into Whiskey Galore the next day with this open bottle, and he says, and I'm not kidding, "Excuse me, I think this has gone off." And they laughed him out of the shop.
Yep.
Upside of that being, I was then re-gifted a very near full bottle of Lafroig 10, which I'll gratefully accept any day. So I'm just trying to, because that smoke is so odd and so unique and distinct, I'm trying to push past that, because what I'm not getting... I'm not getting a big whiff of alcohol. I'm not getting
No, you're not,
There's nothing about nosing that glass to make me feel like, oh boy, it's 56%, brace yourself.
You're absolutely right, yeah. The fact that I can stick my nose in here and take a huge sniff of that without any repercussion is incredible, isn't it? He's using a copper pot still that he's bought himself. They told me it was a 400-litre still, and they actually fire that direct fire with... used cooking oil, so they get that cooking oil from fish and chip shops around that bring them to him, and he's got
Australia.
He's got his own still that he's made just to rectify the cooking oil outside, and he filters that all out, and then he puts it into the burner to fire the still. So,
and it's funny, the legs on this one are behaving in the same way as that Lark, that it's not forming distinct beads and running down individually.
Yeah.
I mean, it's much, much slower.
Yep.
But it's still kind of that one united wave.
I don't think I've ever seen a whiskey do that.
No.
I think ever. They usually sit there with those nice straight legs, but this one is just slowly crawling back like if a water at the beach was receding at one time.
That's exactly it.
Yeah. So Belgrove is the exception, because he is doing this all himself. He's got a couple people who work with him there on the farm. And the thing is, it's in an old horse barn. The still is in a horse stall, and there could have been a horse in there yesterday. It doesn't look like it's not been made food safe or anything like that. The office is in the stall next to it, and next to that stall there are 2 stalls of barrels aging. And the barrels aren't uniform; they're just different kinds of barrels that he's using, and they did tell me that they do obviously put some thought into what goes into what, but it's there's certainly an assortment of barrels in there, barrel types, and barrel sizes, of course. The biggest ones really were, full-size wine barrels, but there was not a lot of them. Most of them were either probably 100 liters, and there was definitely a few 50, 60 liters hanging around there. And actually, Jim Murray, of course. He does a peated rye whiskey, and it scored 98 points with Jim Murray once. Wow. I think it was only a couple of years ago, 2020, I think. So anyway, he's doing some really cool stuff, and it's just really cool to see that this really is the true... I feel like this is a really true expression of Tasmania. There's nothing hidden here. There's not grain from anywhere else. This is really made from their land, and... This is probably the most out there one for sure, but there's also, I did bring the peated rye whiskey, and there's just a regular rye whiskey and an oat whiskey he does. He does a little bit of single malt, but he mostly does that as contracts for other distilleries.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Now it's not crying out for water to be added, which again is somewhat surprising for me. But that finish is still going, still lingering on my tongue even now.
We probably should have finished with this one, because I when I tasted this at the farm, I was tasting it that night, and I left before noon, and I was still tasting that smoke was still coming up later in the day. I don't know. I was in my hotel room later, and there's just suddenly a sheep shit in my mouth. But I don't know. I don't understand it, but it lingers. It really lingers.
It really does.
Yeah.
So, but while I add some water with my very scientific water-adding device, there's a lot of what I'm hearing about this. So, farm to bottle distilleries, of which we've got Lammermoor and Old.
Yep.
We've got people who are making and designing their own stills on site, like the team up at Waiheke. So there's certainly, there are, whether they are lessons that have been learned directly or not, there are still very much some parallels about what's happening there, what's happening here.
Yep.
In your opinion as a distiller, what's something that you saw about their practice over there, their standard practice, that you want to bring back here, be it for yourself or something that our industry should be looking at?
One thing, I noticed that was pretty uniform, I think, across all the distilleries I looked at and asked about was their use of smaller barrels. Over here, of course, most distillers are trying to fill full-size barrels, whether that be, I think that one camera just shut off. Whether that be, wine barrels or bourbon barrels that we're filling up over here. Over there, they have different coopers, actually, that will go around, and they've got different coopers set up to re-cooper big barrels into little barrels. One of them just shut down, unfortunately, the Tasmanian Cask Company. I'm not exactly sure, I can't remember, but just outside of Hobart, they were owned by a partnership that's gone under. But I understand they're hopefully bringing it back with one of the partners. They're trying to find some funding for that. But the fact is that, if you were a distillery over there, you could go to your local cooper, say, hey, I need a bourbon barrel, but I only want a 20-liter barrel. Great, I've got a Buffalo Trace barrel over here. I'll get one made up out of that full-size barrel into a 20-liter barrel for you, and they'll just do it, which is really cool. I mean, it's a skill that no one over here in New Zealand has right now.
Well, apart from Porgano, which do have their own on-site cooper. But that's different, having an on-site cooper versus a contract cooper that can be accessed by other distilleries.
Yeah, and I do think that the smaller barrels, like coopering a smaller barrels, probably, I don't know if it's, does every cooper know that? I don't really know, so that'd be a question for him one day if we ever get to chat with him.
But what are the advantages of having that smaller barrel?
Because we have a similar climate and stuff. I mean, New Zealand and Tasmania is sort of the same. I mean, they're probably a little bit different, but we're not Scotland. We're not. We can't really put something in a barrel and wait 20 years and it not taste like a stick. It's going to be over oaked. But we're not America, where it's warm, really, really warm, really, really hot summers and really, really cold winters either. We're just somewhere in between, and that sort of works well with small barrels and shorter aging. I think if you do your cuts right, it seems to be that they've picked up on this. Because if you go to like Sullivan's Cove, for example, they've got a huge warehouse and just huge racks of small barrels just sitting there. And most of them now are starting to transition as they get bigger to, bigger size barrels, maybe not full size, but bigger for sure, just because it's space as well, they were telling me. Obviously, if you have smaller barrels, they take up more space overall. But, I mean, Tasmanian whiskey is, winning awards and people are loving it, and it's built on the back of these small barrels. So I think that's something we could explore more over here. Yeah.
Now, are there any rules or restrictions around barrel sizes here in New Zealand in terms of making whiskey?
Not a minimum. There's a maximum of 700 litres, but there's no minimum size at the moment. And hopefully there isn't one coming in at any time, because I think, for me personally, we've released 2 batches of whiskey now from our small barrels, and I mean, it is a different profile, and you need to look at it when you're distilling it that it's going into a small barrel. You can't distill it with imperfections. It's really got to be, you could drink this, before it goes into the barrel. It's really got to be nice. So you got to have that in mind when you put it into the barrel, and you got to know what you want the barrel to do to it, So are you just pulling extra flavor, or are you trying to round something off? What is it you're trying to do? So I'm losing a bit of where I'm going with this point at the moment.
Sure. So why aren't we then? Why aren't we as a whiskey industry in New Zealand using more of these smaller 20-litre type of barrels versus a 50 or 100 litre?
It could be a lack of coopers, first of all. I mean, access to bourbon barrels is a bit easier. You can order a container of bourbon barrels from the States quite easily, We have wineries everywhere, and we can get wine barrels easily. So a lack of skill might just be it if we don't have the people to do it. So, but I think there's also a bit of us wanting to be Scots over here. I think probably. I think there's just something inside of us that just says, like, if we're not filling a full-size barrel, we're not doing it right, sort of thing. You know, like the Scots are doing it this way, the Americans are doing it this way. Like, we have to do it this way. You know. I'm not sure if that's it. You know, maybe is it just a supply problem, or is it more of a mindset problem? I'm not sure, but I know I'm certainly just trying to take the road of, obviously it would be much easier for me to find wine barrels and go for wine barrels, but I like the idea of having a small barrel, and you know what? If one messes up, it's not the end of the world. Excuse me. All your bags aren't in one basket. Like, you know, if you have a 200-liter cask and it comes out terrible, that's it. You know, that's tens of thousands of dollars down the drain. And after years of sitting and waiting, you know, because in 2 years, a 200-liter barrel is not going to be ready. 3 years, probably not still, you know, maybe 4 or 5. But in a small barrel, 2 years, you get probably what you want out of that barrel profile. 2 to 3 years, you know, somewhere in there. And if it doesn't work out, you have more choices for blending as well. You might get a different profile from this one barrel. Even if they're the same barrel profile, you might be able to blend these together to create an interesting new whiskey. So I kind of like that idea, you know. That's my case for it, really.
I have just been, as you said, just going back and nosing. I've added some more water, and it has certainly opened it up. And the smoke, while still very much present front and centre, I think it's lost some of, and here's a great word, it's lost some of that fecundity. It's lost some of that rotting dungness of it. It's still odd, and it's
I
still
see what you mean, actually.
It's still the weirdest peated whiskey I've ever nosed, but it's not quite straight up.
There was a terminology problem. It's not really peated, is it? It's not peated. It's smoked.
There we go. Okay.
But I do see what you mean. Yeah, the little bit of water does sort of take off that rot.
Yeah. That rotten edge.
And it actually adds a nice sweetness. Almost, there's that caramel sort of shines through, the candy sort of sweetness. It's in there. Yeah, I quite like that, actually, with a little bit of water.
That has become... But that finish is still very peppery, very active. There's still a lot going on, and partly it could be, I think the water has opened up more of the rye as well, and given that more space to play underneath that smokiness. But yeah, that is intriguing.
It is, yeah.
And it certainly challenged me here today. That is...
I did question whether I would bring this one out today or one of his other offerings, which is a bit lighter, of course. This is the most potent one. I mean, there's a more potent version. I didn't bring it home because it was too potent, really, for me even. And I love smoke, but there's a limit, I suppose, right? But one other thing I kind of wanted to touch on Tasmania's sort of industry with all this and these small barrels and everything is they're also doing a lot of small bottles. And when I say small, 500 mils is not uncommon. And
so that's this here.
That is a 500 mil. If you go to the store and buy a Lark whiskey, 500 mils. If you go to the store and buy 90% of Tasmanian whiskies, it'll be 500 mils.
Versus 700 being
the sort of standard, eh?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, while I don't know specifics, I do know that as much as I like to gripe about our rising alcohol excise tax, it's still nothing compared to theirs.
Well, funny story. So they do have a higher excise tax to us. It's $100 approximately right now, per liter of pure alcohol. However, this is something they don't really tell you in the marketing brochure. Each distillery will get a rebate of up to $350,000 on their up that first $350,000 is tax free. So basically, if you're not making $350,000 worth of whiskey, you're not actually paying any excise. If the whiskey went through your still, that's their
Okay.
their.
But you still, great for the distiller, but you go to the other end and look at the consumer, and they still, the proportion of tax that they pay per bottle is still significantly higher than what we're paying. I remember, last time I was in Australia and I went to their, what they call the off license, and just thinking, I'll just go back to the apartment that we've rented, grab some beer, and was floored at how much I was paying for a box of 12 versus what we would pay here. And it's not often that you go overseas and you look at prices in the supermarket or the store and you think, gosh, New Zealand's got it so much cheaper.
Yeah. I asked this question because I said, you guys have this excise relief. What's going on with the prices? And I'll tell you, the prices are really $200 higher, or $200 plus. The most basic ones are, you'd be really lucky to find stuff around $150, and that's 500 mils the bottle still.
Yeah.
Most of them are $200 plus for a 500 ml bottle. So I kind of was asking, like, what's the deal? And I did get a bit of, run around. It's kind of, I think most of these prices were set before this rebate came into effect. And potentially the what's happened is they've kept that money, and they might be growing the business with it. It's absolutely a thing. But the pricing of Tasmanian whiskey is quite astonishing, really. It's quite high. I don't think you could have it over here, really, at those prices. And like I say, it's not actually taxed, really, for the most part. So, what are you really paying for is kind of the question, I suppose. If I'm not being too direct with our Australian brethren. I know, I understand there's costs involved. Distilling is a very expensive industry, and I know that firsthand, but I don't know if I could ever get away with selling a 500 ml bottle of just regular old single malt for $200 plus a bottle if it was just a regular old release. So that was just one thing I really noticed, and I sort of questioned a couple times and never really got an answer on. And I think I didn't get an answer means I kind of got my own answer out of it. So,
sure.
Yeah. The last thing I want to say just about all this is points to New Zealand, because we have Gladfield malt. Gladfield malt, and I'm blanking on the other one. There is another maltster here in Canterbury. We have two amazing maltsters here in New Zealand. We have a lot of great grain. And I think most New Zealand whiskey is being made from that grain. And we have a huge assortment of pre-smoked malts and such like that. They don't really have that option over there. And yeah, our prices are lower. Bottles are bigger. I think New Zealand's doing some really great stuff. I just don't think there's any reason we can't look to Tasmania as well to see what else we can do, because we're very small compared to them still. We're still burgeoning our industry. So
yes.
That's where I kind of sit, and it was a great trip, and I got to fill a barrel at Nonesuch with the distiller Chris over there, which was really cool. But we have some news to talk about.
Well, it's actually been a big week in the New Zealand spirits industry.
It really has. I'll start off with we'll go up, okay. I think, in tier. Reefton Distillery has done their 100th mash. That's probably a couple weeks ago now at this point, but they've only just started mashing whiskey a couple months ago. So for them to be at their 100th mash already, big congratulations to them for sure. Juno Gin, I think I was just telling you about this before, but they've got a blank canvas competition, which is a design competition they do for their labels, because every year they do a series of 4 unique gins, and they put this awesome artwork on them, but the artwork is designed by just everyday people, whoever submits these, and they actually give away a prize of $1,000 for each design. So there's 4 prizes of $1,000 and other stuff on top of that prize. So if you know how to design stuff,
yeah, see, that's when they're designed by ordinary everyday people, and I guarantee they're not. Because if I'm submitting an artwork,
send in that crayon drawing there, Cameron. Yeah,
no,
maybe
I don't think so somehow. But still, a great competition, great prize.
Very cool, and they do it actually every year, and they're very unique releases when they do that. So it's really cool to see them supporting local artists with it.
Cool.
Yeah. Finally, the big one.
The big one.
Cardrona Distillery. They've been sold.
They have. And it is... I think it's fair to say reactions have been mixed. I have seen some people celebrating the move.
Yep.
And I think that, look, if the owner of the business is happy, if Desiree's happy, if that's what they want, then congratulations. Clearly that was what they were aiming for.
Yeah.
But I did see on Facebook when news outlets posted that article, the vast majority of the comments underneath the article were negative. Here's another Kiwi business being sold offshore. Are there going to be pluses and minuses? Absolutely. One, we always... Cadrona aside, anytime any major New Zealand company is sold offshore, foreign ownership, you've got to look at, what the next steps are going to be. Now, Desiree's remained control. She still remains in charge over there, so that's great that it's still kind of, Kiwi control. But, long term, what is that foreign ownership going to mean?
Yeah.
But on the flip side of that, is it going to allow Cadrona to take their whiskey, their gin, their vodka? Is it going to allow them access to more markets, overseas markets, really give them a bigger push and a bigger reach? Yeah, almost certainly.
Yeah.
Why else would you do something like this?
Yeah, if I can interject, the company they've been sold to is International Beverage.
Yeah.
It's a very boring name for a company, if I might say. But it's actually a really cool company because they do own, I think, Old Putney.
Yes, Old Putney.
I'm trying to remember if there's a couple other Scotch brands in there, as well as I think some French wine brands. I think it's something like that. But it's a small portfolio, but big brand portfolio. So I think their goal really is to really get Cardrona to the world, which for New Zealand spirits in general could be a really good thing. It is hard to find that money in little New Zealand to push your brand out into the world, isn't it? I mean, I know that firsthand for sure. That just to get anywhere across any water is very difficult. And it's expensive and it's time consuming, and you need to make a lot of juice to do it. And I think this sort of investment that they're sort of promising, from what I understand, really will mean a big increase in production. I don't know if they're going to change anything on site per se. I mean, time will tell. But I understand they've sold the land, the infrastructure, everything to the company. So everything has gone to them. So yeah, they really do have a blank canvas to work with, and it's a beautiful canvas down in Cardrona.
It is. When I look to the US and some of the recent sales of whiskey distilleries to larger companies with distribution portfolios, the ones that have worked are the ones that have taken more of a hands-off approach. Clearly, you know what you're doing to have gotten to this point. Our goal, if we want to be profitable, because that's the goal after all, is not immediately to go in and start meddling. So I would sincerely hope that beyond a measured scale up, that they don't immediately start going in and meddling and ultimately taking or making negative changes to what is a good company.
I think with them, they've got the experience with the bigger brands already. They can probably offer the guidance necessary, and hopefully with Desiree staying in control of operations, Desiree can ask as many questions as she wants to the right people now and get answers right away. I know she get a lot of pushback when she first started up in Scotland, especially. They were telling her that wasn't really something that could be done down here. And here she is, having created a business that's been bought up by a company that owns many of those Scotch distilleries. So quite cool. I mean,
if their ultimate goal is to take New Zealand whiskey, to take New Zealand spirits, not forgetting their gin and their vodka, which they do. If that's the goal, is to take it to the world, bang, tick. That will absolutely help them do that. But I still will be keeping an eye on it as, foreign ownership of a large company which makes up a big chunk of the New Zealand spirits industry. Just treat it with care, okay?
Yeah. You are stewards of an important brand in New Zealand. It's our second or third biggest distillery, I think. So hopefully they will treat it with the respect it deserves. But I think at the end of the day, we're all excited. I think to see the industry grow and to see them grow, and it's great, really, for the region, I guess, with the tourism and everything as well. So, yeah.
And an even bigger news still. This Herrick Creek, and I notice you haven't written the name on the front here, limited release. So people who have been watching on YouTube this whole time, wondering what it is that is in this barrel.
Yeah.
What is it?
So the name I've told you is probably changed now, because I was going to call this beer ski, right? Mm-hmm. It's a whiskey made from beer, but I've changed the name to Beer Shine, to align more with our moonshines, but just because I felt it wasn't completely appropriate to call it anything related to a whiskey. I mean, it's been aged nearly 2 years. It's not 2 years old anyway. It's nearly 2 years old though. Aged in a charred French oak barrel, and it is a combination of two beers. It's a porter. It was a peanut butter and jelly porter, I believe, and a pilsner. So just a regular old pilsner. The two of them could not. They were still great beers. They just hadn't stopped fully fermenting, I understand, so they couldn't be bottled. So I took them from a local brewery here in Christchurch. I fermented them a little bit further just to get all the alcohol out, and double pot distill it into what I call a whiskey, but it's certainly not a whiskey, I want to say.
Beer Shine.
Beer Shine, yeah.
And so now you've just bottled this.
Yeah.
As in, you were bottling today.
Yeah.
And so this will be available from the farmer's market and from the website.
This week, yep.
Nice, so keep an eye out for that. Okay, so peanut butter and jelly porter plus a pilsner.
Yeah, so there's definitely some hops in here.
Yes.
Yeah, there's definitely some chocolate, some big chocolate I found.
Because your porters and your stouts aren't typically high hopped beers.
No.
But yes, I'm getting this really.
And to be honest, the beers weren't that hoppy anyway. Like the pilsner wasn't that hopped. It's just that distillation does distillation, and it distills flavors. It's going to concentrate things. And hops is one of those things that comes through the still very easily.
Yes.
But I was happy to have it because, honest, it's different,
That it is. And I've tried smoke sheep shit tonight. Yes, I'm getting that the hops up forward.
Yep.
The chocolatey note right underneath.
I do
46%.
46%. I do find that chocolate note really does ring true. Like, that's a big chocolate note for me. It's a sweet chocolate. It's a sweet hop. There's a sweetness to the nose for sure. And so the nose on it is really quite light and bright, and it's really big for sure, but it's light. What do you think about the taste?
Oh yeah, that is. The hops are more forward on the nose. It's not like I'm drinking a hoppy beer, but what I do get is really that peanut butter.
Yeah.
Peanut butter jelly. It's almost like if you've ever, and I don't recommend doing this too often, but if you were to get like Nutella on one piece of toast and then nice fruity jam on the other and eat that as a sandwich, which would probably be sugar overload. But I'm getting, chocolatey jam, like chocolate jam donut kind of.
I really taste the porter in this, Like that, it does just sort of almost taste like porter whiskey, like to me, like stout whiskey almost. Without
actually being a whiskey.
Yes, let me say that again.
Beer
it
show.
Is not a whiskey.
But intriguing is what it is. Look, it's been 3 very distinct, very unique offerings for this episode.
Yeah.
Will people now? Are these Tasmanian distilleries? Are they shipping to New Zealand?
They are actually.
Okay.
Yeah. I didn't need to bring this back in my suitcase. I could have ordered it, but I was there, and it's more fun when you're there.
Buy it at the source.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So Belgrove, you can buy that distillery or online. They ship to New Zealand as well as Nonsuch, the other one I went to, Lark, I believe as well. If you're ever visiting Tasmania, I just can't recommend it enough. Really, it was beautiful. They do have snakes, apparently, quite bad snakes, but we don't have that.
We're talking Australia here, which it's funny because when you bring up the major tourist destinations of Australia, Hobart and Tasmania doesn't typically feature high up on that list.
It was popping, actually. Like, down in the town, I went down a couple nights, and like, people are out and about. Like, Christchurch feels boring compared to that. And I was out on a Monday night, you know, and there's people everywhere. I couldn't believe it, because I think Tasmania, I'm just going off a number in my head, but I think they have a population of like 200,000 people, which is like less than Christchurch, isn't it? That's the whole island. And I mean, little old Hobart has just got a party going on a Monday night, and there was nothing happening. Honestly, it was just people out and about enjoying themselves. And there was just cool bars, and like there was just all sorts going on, and it was just a great vibe, you know. So I think, if you're looking for somewhere that's not, Melbourne or Brisbane or something, it's just Hobart's the place to be, really. And there's so much whiskey to try.
Well, speaking of being out and about and enjoying yourselves, maybe we should let people do the same.
Yes, fair enough. Yeah, we've rambled on long enough. So thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode. I know that it's a bit of an out there sidebar to what we're saying this whole stuff is, this podcast is about. But it's not really, is it? I mean, this is about learning, what can New Zealand learn from people who are, industries that are established already, right? So Tasmania, I just happen to be going there for professional development. So we can talk about it in this episode. This isn't a normal thing.
But the next, we do have an interview lined up with a New Zealand-based distiller.
Yeah.
So that is going to be exciting. We do have some great interviews lined up that I'm quite excited for. I promise that if you tune in for future episodes, it's not just going to be me and Tom this whole time.
Yep.
So if you have questions, if you want to know more, that's one L, Distil-Nation NZ@gmail.com, or any of the social channels where you happen to see one of these videos. We'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Get in touch. Thank you for listening. And remember to review this and share it with your friends and family. And cheers, everybody.
Cheers.